Welcome to the I Told You So podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Kohl. I started this podcast because I noticed an erosion of societal discourse and how normal conversations are often fueled by polarization. The I Told You So podcast is really an opportunity for healthy discourse and effective debate. I select topics to debate with listeners and guests of the I Told You So podcast. Listeners and guests predict what will happen in the future, and I track predictions and announce who predicted accurately when those predictions become true. Discussions and debates can be about any topic and should be focused on what will happen in the future. The podcast offers topics where listeners and guests can discuss and debate with the goal of predicting the future so they can proudly say, I told you so. My guest for this episode is Karla Hagemeister. Karla has lived in Manhattan, Kansas since 1993. She graduated with a degree in social work from Kansas State University and has served the community during her time in Manhattan, most recently as a member of the USD 383 Manhattan-Ogden Board of Education, and as the executive director of the Flint Hills Breadbasket. On this episode, we discuss the misconception that late teens and young adults are hopelessly lost. Karla, thanks for being a guest on the I Told You So podcast. Let me start the conversation by asking you, why do you think there is a misconception that late teens and young adults are hopelessly lost, and how is this misconception consequential to you?
So I think that we come to that from a place of good intentions. I think we come to it as parents. I am the parent of both a 21-year-old and a 15-year-old. So both as a member of the Board of Education since 2018, watching young people, whether it's our kids entering school or all the way up through high school graduation, as a Board of Education member, but then also as a parent, watching my kids kind of filter through this time period, and then living in the world of a greater media cycle that has a lot of anxiety and a lot of opinions about the state of our young people and the state of our kids. And I think a lot of what we see in the greater media picture doesn't necessarily give our kids as much credit as they deserve. I think that oftentimes the stories that get attention are bad news carries fast. And it taps into our anxieties as parents about what's going to happen to our kids. Are they going to be okay? And it feeds that. And what we end up seeing is a whole lot of gloom and doom and worry about what's going to happen to our kids and what's going on with them. And we're not necessarily seeing the good news that is still there, that is present every day in the things that our kids are doing. Good news just doesn't travel as well as bad news, unfortunately.
Well, as a parent and as a member of the school board, what's your experience and what do you see in our youth that really, goes against the broader message that we see in the world? It seems like there's this prevalent message that we continue to see, especially after the pandemic, that our youth is lost, like we've talked about. But what do you see in our youth that goes against the broader message that we see in the world?
I see it in my kids. I see it in the things that our kids are doing in the greater scope in regards to, I have that seat at the school board table. I have that seat to hear about all of the things that are happening from our student council. They come to us with the different projects and accomplishments that our kids are making. So on the one level, I hear a lot about those accomplishments that are happening and that have continued to happen even through COVID-19. And then on the flip of it, there are times where you see kids who have really overcome a great deal of hardship, that their accomplishment is not going to be that they are a governor's scholar or some big accolade or a big scholarship, but that they've actually overcome a whole lot of things on a smaller level or that are big in their own world. I've seen the generosity of kids in a lot of ways, the ways that they look out for each other, the way that they're looking to care for the world in ways that a lot of times adults have kind of moved past. They're busy living their lives. They're worried about their bills. They're worried about, what comes next as adults. And our kids are still looking at the world with where do they fit and what's their opportunity to have an impact. And I think that I choose to look more through that lens for our kids and that optimistic lens than that lens of fear. And I think that that's one of the things that has changed for me as a parent over time, is that especially with my first, it was really easy to look at him and say, here's all the great things that you could do because you're a great, smart kid. And you've got two supportive parents that love you and that support you. And here's the path. And realizing somewhere along the line that no matter how much of a clear path I could set out for him, he had to choose it and want it. And that his choosing a different path didn't make it bad. It's just made it different. And that he's a good person, that he's got a lot of great ideas and the great accomplishments that just look different than what on paper or what I might have planned out for him when he was a twinkle in my eye. So I think that again, just that bad news travels fast, and so many of our kids are doing blood drives, they're looking out for each other. The volunteerism that I see from kids that goes beyond what's required for school or what they have to do, the number of kids that get involved in volunteer work and then stay with it, or get involved in a group or club and stay with each other and stay through a longer period of time. I really see it in our kids, and I see that scope of it. I also think about that just generationally, that there's a little bit of a message that just repeats itself. History doesn't repeat, it rhymes. So my generation, I was born in the 70s, so I'm a Gen Xer, so go and look at all the things that our parents worried about for us, go to the generation of the people who are coming of age in the 70s and what their parents worried about for them. It looks different, but we're really just experiencing the same thing, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the Tipper Gore and video games and movie ratings, like a lot of stuff that like we look at now and say, man, there was a whole lot of angst over a kid watching the movie Gremlins that we look back at now and say, that movie didn't hold up real well, but did it really, really garner the anxiety that it might have had for our parents at the time? Just hindsight is 2020. And when you look back at things with more maturity or more experience under your belt, sometimes you really realize like it wasn't as dire as I thought it was. And people are resilient. And I think that when we put hope first and put relationships first and people for who they are first, like I'm just going to take that optimistic look that things are going to work out for the most part.
So let me follow up a little bit with that, and I really appreciate your outlook and your optimism, and just your examples of how you watch the youth and even your own children succeeding, even despite the challenges they have. But as you know, being on the school board, You are responsible really for the education of all students and making sure that all students have the equal opportunities for education. And so looking at that full scope of students, would you say that I would say, quote unquote, the marginalized students are having the same sort of success that you just mentioned? Or is there still a challenge there?
There is definitely still a challenge there. I think that there's challenges that are happening within the school system itself, and then there's the larger challenges that are happening at the broader scope that pour into the school that we don't have the control or influence over all the time, but impact who that student is and how they present when they come to school each day. And that outside world is bleeding more and more into the school day. And I think it is a very concrete challenge for our teachers, our school administrators, and our school systems in general to figure out what's that balance between what is a parental role or a community role and what is the role of the school. And you can see that tension happening now in that conversation around parental rights, just basic education testing or school standards. What is the role of the school? Is the role of the school simply to educate? Is it academics? Well, okay, we could say yes, but, and Ben, you and I know each other, and I know that your kids have been involved in the performing arts and how big of a role that has played in your kid's life.
Oh, it's been huge. It's been huge.
Huge.
Yep.
Same with mine.
Mm-hmm.
And the relationship between music and math, that is there. And not just music, but whatever it is that engages kids in learning and the ways that we can apply learning in all different things. I think that is one of the strengths of our school system for the size of community that we have, that we have so many different opportunities for our kids to participate in the activities that get them excited about learning. And whether it's the pure academic track of wanting to, get the college courses and do the high level math, high level foreign language, whatever that might be, or looking at career and technical education and the hands-on opportunities that our kids have. And again, both of my kids have participated in both ends of those things, plus the performing arts. So the fact that our kids can walk out with a certificate from our local technical college, that they can have experience, that we still have auto tech, and my daughter is taking that's on her schedule for next year. She just finished wood tech. That we've got opportunities for culinary arts, fashion design, like all these different fields that our kids can connect with that aren't necessarily what a person would center their focus on as regards of the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And so I have a really broad scope and a broad idea of what actually is public education. Circling back, though, I do think that it is a big challenge that our kids oftentimes, because of a lot of outside world factors, poverty, food insecurity, instability at home, mental health challenges, any of those sorts of things, that our kids are coming to school, that is part of who they are. That is the fabric of what's happening in their lives. And so just how I show up at work, a full person with the good, the bad, and the ugly, that's how our kids are showing up at school. And before a kid is going to be able to learn and be ready to learn, sometimes those things are going to be impediments to their ability to do those things. And we can say, I could sit back at the school board table and say, well, it's not my job. It's not the job of the schools to provide mental health care. It's not the job of the schools to feed people or to wash their clothes or do X, Y, or Z. But the reality is that before that kid is going to be ready to learn, that has to happen. because if I've not had a meal, if I don't feel clean or I don't feel dignified or don't feel like my basic needs are met, how much learning am I going to do in the course of that day? And so I feel like a lot of times our schools are in a little bit of a rock and hard place. Not a little bit of a rock and hard place, a big rock and hard place, because those things have to happen. And I can sit there all day and say, it's not the job, it's not the job, it's not the job. But without a community in the larger sense that is going to say, we need to tackle these issues, it is what it is. And I'll go back and say, when we were thinking about and talking about what we were going to talk about today, one of the things that in the course of civil conversation and one of the guides for me has been a podcast called Pantsuit Politics. It's two female lawyers by background that do a podcast. They live in Kentucky. And they basically really have that. It's a very similar premise in the sense of that we might get there from different ways, but there are good ways to have civil discourse and conversation with each other. And then I forgot my point.
Oh, you're talking about the podcast with the two female lawyers?
Yeah, just that aspect of that you have what you have, and that we have to deal with the facts on the ground. Oh, I got it. Give me time. And this conversation was really present with them during the COVID pandemic, and how we as a society have moved from a outward community focused society to very consumer focused. That we approach a lot of things in our daily lives not as a member of a community, but as a consumer of a product. So think about how sometimes we see it in a lot of fields. We see it at school with, well, I pay taxes. I am a member of the community. You are my employee. This is what I want you to do. As opposed to, we are a school community as a whole. We are a team working for the better part of our kids in education, or in our faith communities. I tithe. I am a member of this church. I have this standing. I've been a member of this church for 20 years. And so therefore you should do what I want you to do. That we've really, as a society, moved away from an outward focus of how do we work together to solve problems. And we've taken it into you have something I want. It's very transactional. And I think that is something that is to the detriment of us as a whole. And I think that the more that we can move back into conversations around how do we work together as a community, and that none of these problems happen in a vacuum, and none of the solutions are going to happen because of one person doing one thing, or one part of the system doing something, then I think that's where we'll get some achievement on moving some of these problems towards a solution.
But there really are, and you've mentioned this, challenges. There really are real challenges for young people, maybe more than ever before. And I know, talked about the different decades, different challenges that were prominent during those times, but it's different today. And so, for example, let's talk about learning loss. So, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, the learning loss that occurred for the youth in primary and secondary education during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we can also talk about this: the increase in depression and anxiety and suicidal thoughts and tendencies. So I'm getting a little feedback. So I'll pause a little bit. Okay, there we go. So let's maybe talk about the learning loss that occurred, and if you saw that, and during the pandemic, were teachers talking about that were supervision of the schools talking about this, and what were they going to do about it? What were they doing about it? And then we also know we have lots of different studies and reports that have come out and said that the levels of depression and anxiety and suicidal thoughts have just rapidly increased. And so how do we help youth deal with these challenges and even recover from these challenges that they currently face today? So let's talk about learning loss first. And let me just couch that in with I was working at the time with some researchers in primary and secondary education, faculty members at different institutions working and teaching and doing research for higher education institutions. And they were starting to write even then about the learning loss that is going to occur and what are they going to do about it. It was a foreshadow of, if we continue this pandemic with the covering the faces and locking up things and the online learning and everything else, how is going to affect the learning of the students? And what they found is that it really drastically reduced the learning over a year and a half. And even some studies report that it's almost as though some of those students in primary and secondary education flunked a class or two because they didn't get what they were supposed to get to base the education on that they need to learn. For instance, in third grade, you have to get your foundation of math principles. And if you were a third grader during the pandemic and your whole learning system was off balance, how do you go on to fourth grade and fifth grade without really the foundational principles of math? So that's just one example. So that's what these researchers are writing about, and now we know today that that was really, really a bad deal for students. And I mentioned depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. There's correlation to the learning loss and those students struggling with depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. And so, and just even a purpose. So, and and I use third grade as an example, but it was all throughout primary and secondary education, and even through the college level. So it's kind of a long, a few statements about the question, but really, how do we help youth deal with these issues, these challenges, and how do we help them recover from these challenges that they face today?
Mm-hmm. So I think it goes back to what I was saying in regards to looking at it not as consumers, but as a whole system. That I think, and I think one of the challenges with the information that you just shared, that I don't want to argue it or dispute it, but I want to say that what we're looking at is a great big pool of data that varies so dramatically from school size to location to urban versus rural versus age of the kids that you're talking about. So I really want to just speak to the kids here in our district because I think I have the best direct information in regards to that. And so I can speak to the system as a whole, as I experienced it as a school board member, and I can speak to it as a parent of one was a junior and one was a 6th grade rising to 7th grade, so elementary to middle school during the pandemic. And I think what we saw on this system level coming out of the pandemic for what our kids here experienced, I would say our teachers would share that it was hardest, obviously, on our youngest kids, because you're talking about a lot of social skill development, language development. Having masks on young kids was a challenge for a multitude of reasons. And you have the realities of what the outcomes of that were. I won't go back and relitigate the validity of the decisions one way or the other, because I think we were making the best decisions that we could make with the information that we had at the time. And I think that we at the district here, we're looking not just at what is safest or best for the kids, but how do we keep staff and people in the building? That part of what we were balancing out of that entire equation was that you can't just have, okay, we could have all the kids here, but if you don't have adults to teach the kids, or you don't have adults to drive the buses and do all the other things, then you can't have kids in school at all. And there were, overall, I think we were successful in keeping our schools open. There were definitely districts that had to shut down for weeks at a time because they had so many adults out. I think that we, in the end of that, I think we released for Thanksgiving a day early because we had a high level of adults out sick in several of our like our elementary schools. Like we ended up having to close and quit operations one day out of the rest of the planned response because we didn't have enough adults in the building to do what we needed to do to educate kids. Now, the rest of it, with the way that we processed it and the way we worked through it, obviously there was a lot of challenges on there. But again, we didn't know. You don't know what you don't know. But coming out of it, I think we definitely, in the first year fully back, we definitely saw, especially with our younger kids, the results of not having that. How do you operate in school? What does it look like? And that cohort now that would have been going into kindergarten, I believe, is now finishing up their second grade year. And if you went across the district and said, what's your second grade classes like? You're going to have a year, I think, across the board where that is a group that has more challenges. Now, could you go back with any teacher and say, are there particular years where you just have a class that just is just that class, that group, and you're going to see it? And so our job coming out of that was to say, okay, this is what we have. How do we bring them back? How do we address the learning loss? Because you don't give up on the kids. You don't say, well, you didn't get third grade fundamental math, and so therefore you just continue on. You say, what do we need to do to get these skills and get these gaps filled for you? And so for us, there's always been learning differentiation, providing different opportunities for kids to get that support that they need. So your MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, it will look like, probably over the years, it could easily look like having some more supportive classes, maybe in the middle school level or the high school level. It looks like for some of our students, we've introduced a sheltered math class, which is a more specific, directed, getting those fundamentals in for kids who need not just a little bit of support, but longer term support. So we've brought in student behavioral specialists to our school, behavioral support specialists to the schools. So again, when we came back from COVID, that first year back, where you had all these kids that had been either not around each other or had been home a lot, didn't necessarily have the level of supervision at home that they would have had at school, we had a lot of behavioral issues. And so we brought in a team that said, okay, how do we do this? How do we approach this? How do we support kids in choosing better behaviors? And so you don't give up on those kids. You say, what do they need? And you put in the support systems that they need. I would say also that frequently, to fall back on the correlation does not necessarily indicate causation. That we hear a lot more about that increase of suicidality or depression, mental health issues. I wonder this is more as a parent. I wonder more as a parent if COVID stripped away some of the stigma or shields that kids had around it or that adults had around it. And we have started asking more questions than we did before. And I say that as a parent who and he's okay with me sharing this. Let me premise it that way. As a parent of a young adult now who has had a diagnosis of depression since he was a sophomore in high school, pre-COVID, pre-epidemic. And it came for him, or how it manifested out of him as a very smart kid, was a looking at life of, what are my chances of doing better than my parents have done financially? And we know that that's not an unrealistic concern for our kids. We know that that is a realistic worry for our kids to have. We know that our kids, as they're growing into young adulthood, are marrying later, they're having children later, they're buying houses later. Not because they don't want to do those things, but because sometimes economically those things are not as available to them. And they're looking at, what are my options? And so for us as parents with a child who is presenting with depression as a sophomore in high school, when we're like, you've got two parents at home, we've got a good home life, what's your problem, but what's happening here? What we really ended up discovering was that he's not unusual, that there's a lot of kids that are experiencing that. And for me as a mom who was on the school board at the time and now has a teen who is smart and accomplished and has mental health issues, and there's a part of me that, coming from an Army family, thought to myself, all right, what's the reality? He didn't want to go into the military service, but what is our military service's statement these days about mental health and mental illness? Do we take people with a history of depression? I would rather somebody get treatment for depression and then go on and be able to serve, or whatever that might be. There has been a long time stigma around mental health for our kids. And I think one of the things I'd shared that I wanted to talk about today was the fact that I think that for many ways, our kids have released a lot of that stigma. Because when I went to him and said, hey, I want to be able to talk about this as a parent, but it's not my story to tell, it's yours. And he looked at me and said, what do I have to be ashamed of? It's mental health, same as physical health. And his trite answer to me was, it's school that's making me depressed anyway, Mom, so go ahead. I mean, that was the answer of a 16-year-old. But I think that was fair, though, was that he didn't look at it. He didn't look at himself as being faulty or defective or anything worse about him because of having depression. He looked at it like, this is just a reality, the same way as a person who has diabetes or some other situation. Our kids have let go of a lot of things that we, as an older generation, had shame in and held back and didn't talk about. And so I would much rather have a generation of people that are willing to talk about the issues around social media, the issues around mental health, the issues around education and learning loss. And let's talk about these things, not let's keep them internal to our families. Let's keep them internal to ourselves and show a pretty picture on Facebook and pretend like everything is great, because we know that that's not the case. So I guess to be at the end of it, because I'm always going to come through with that optimistic outlook, at least for the most part, is that I think that we can really overcome a lot of these challenges that we've been talking about today when we're open about them, when we talk about them, when we don't try to pretend they don't exist, and when we work together to face them.
Great comments. Really appreciate that. I really appreciate your experience, especially in the school board, as a parent, and just really your heart and passion for the community that in which you serve. Just really appreciate that. So, Karla, thanks so much for being a guest on the I Told You So podcast. And like I said, I really appreciate your comments about today's youth and your optimism about their resilience and perseverance. Do you have a prediction that you'd like to state regarding the topic of, I would say, the topic of youth education and development?
Oh, no, I'm not going to.
Okay.
I'm going to say that chapter's not been written yet.
Okay.
And that, we're going to see where it could go. And I hope that what they end up doing is better than whatever I could have possibly predicted.
So if there's anything, you're just optimistic.
Absolutely.
All right.
I'm going to choose optimism.
Okay, good.
That's going to be where it gets us.
If listeners want to learn more and engage with Karla, simply send an email message to her at her email address, and it's karlahagemeister@gmail.com. And I'll just spell it out for those of you just listening on Spotify. It's KarlaHagemeister@gmail.com. So, because this podcast is about predicting the future, my questions to those listening are: do you agree with Karla Hagemeister's assessment of today's youth? Why or why not? Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of youth in education and development, and why or why not? And would you say that our U.S. primary and secondary educational systems properly preparing youth for the future? Why or why not? So let me know. You let Karla know, but you can let me know by sending a text message or email to me. And you can call me too. Text or call at 1-785-473-3721, or my email address is ITYS@BenKohlITYS.com. That's ITYS at my name, BenKohlITYS.com. That's all one word. Or post on any of my social media channels. If there's another podcast platform you prefer, let me know that too. So go to the I Told You So podcast website at BenKohlITYS.com, and there you can connect, and also you can get your own I Told You So items at the merchandise link. So you can choose from shirts and hoodies and hats and coffee mugs and lots of other items. The I Told You So podcast is, at least I hope, a space for healthy discourse and effective debate with the goal of predicting the future so you can proudly say, I told you so. Also, if your business or organization is interested in advertising on the I Told You So podcast, please let me know that too. So thanks for tuning in to the I Told You So podcast. And thanks again to my guest, Karla Hagemeister. Followers of the podcast are very important, so please follow, like, subscribe, give a high rating, share your comments, and share with your friends. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Kohl, and I hope to hear from you soon.